Hi. So, representing and referring. Lippi's Madonna della Quintola does not represent Lucrezia Booty because it does not refer to her. If David Copperfield does not refer to Charles Dickens, it does not represent him. Representing is a kind of referring, but not all referring is representing, not even all referring by representations. Reference is sometimes effected by means of a purely fictional character who signifies, stands for, calls to mind an actual person. Doctor. Ça, c'est Proust, ça. Reference is sometimes effected by means of a purely fictional character who signifies, stands for, calls to mind an actual person. Actual person. Fictional, where is it? Fictional. Sorry. Excusez-moi. Ouais, mais enfin, t'es un gamin à 18 ans. Même à mon âge, hein, franchement. Sorry. Ah oui, 2 secondes. Je vois pas pourquoi un gars de 18 ans serait plus pertinent qu'un gars de 17 pour le coup. Dr. Pangloss in Voltaire's Candide stands for Leibniz, to whom the work refers. Spenser's Fairy Queen refers to Queen Elizabeth by means of a stand-in in the fictional world, the character Gloriana. But I prefer not to regard these works as representing Leibniz and Queen Elizabeth in our sense. It is not fictional of Leibniz that his name is Pangloss and that he became a beggar covered with sores, dull-eyed, with the end of his nose fallen away, his mouth awry, his teeth black, who talked huskily, was tormented with a violent cough and spat out a tooth at every cough, and in this sorry state met his old philosophy student Candide, to whom he continued to prove that all is for the best. That's good. Copy. Good. There is a note 6, Candide chapter 3 and 4. We are not asked to imagine this of Leibniz, although we are expected to think about him when we read about Pangloss, to notice and reflect on certain resemblances between the two. Pangloss in Voltaire's device for referring to Leibniz, but he refers to Leibniz in order to comment on him, not in order to establish fictional truths about him. Reference thus builds on the generation of fictional truths, ones not about the things referred to, is one common kind of allegory. Allegory. Sorry. Confusion can arise from the fact that we commonly speak of allegorical references in the same language that we use for representing. Commonly speak. Candide is said to be about Leibniz, or to represent him. Madonna della Quiniola is described as a picture of Lucrezia Beauty, although it neither represents nor refers to her. Against, we must be wary of the promiscuity of these expressions. Just a moment. Here. Just a moment. Et tu es obligé de devoir voter pour donner ton avis? Oui, mais pour ça, il faut quand même connaître certaines choses et avoir certaines expériences, ce qui est forcément, bah, moins le cas, quand tu es plus jeune. Du moins qui est généralement moins le cas quand tu es plus jeune. Ouais, de toute façon, là, quand il fait de l'humour, il fait de l'humour donc derrière, c'est plus en mode, je suis jaloux, tu vois? Je peux me permettre, hein, comme il y a personne qui regarde en direct. So, in a series of three anonymous French broadsheets, effet de la Ligue, Philip II of Spain and the Guises are portrayed as a three-headed monster trampling the people while a town burns in the background. The monster is later conquered by a courageous lion, Henry IV. We do not have to hold that fictionally Philip and the Guises are a three-headed monster and Henry a lion. My preference is to say that in the fictional world, purely fictional, a purely fictional three-headed monster is destroyed by a purely fictional lion, and that by arranging for this to be the case, the anonymous artist allegorically refers to and comments on Philip, the Guises, and Henry. If the pictured animals had faces resembling those of the real people, it would be more natural to hold that fictionally the people are animals. Allegorical reference is sledgehammer obvious in Candid, and the French broadsheets. Less definite allegorical references can be found almost wherever one wants to find them. Think of Kafka's Metamorphoses and Beckett's Waiting for Godot. But they are hard to prove. This is one of the great virtues of allegory. It is a trick to outwit the censor, including sometimes the appreciator's own internal censor. The Javanese puppeteer who chooses an episode from the Mahabharata epic in which an ancient evil king is deposed may get his message about current events across without running afoul of the authorities. I am indebted to A. L. Becker for this example. Here is the performance of the episode, not the work performed, that carries the allegorical reference. Anonymous French effet de la Ligue. Uses of objects. What is the point of having works represent actual things? There is a strangely persistent tendency to consider connections with the real world gratuitous, at least from an aesthetic point of view. What matters, it is supposed, is what sorts of people and places and events are to be found in a fictional world, not whether any of them are actual. Even with this attitude, one must allow objects of representation a certain practical value. If a storyteller wants the setting for his tale to be a large modern industrial city in a nation with both imperialist and democratic traditions, and with economic and class structures of certain kinds, he can provide such a background in a stroke by locating the action in London, by making it fictional of the actual London that the action takes place there. This can usually be accomplished just by calling the city in which the action occurs London. This spares storyteller and reader alike tedious time and page-consuming specification of details about the setting. It also avoids placing undue emphasis on the setting at the expense of the action. The reader simply assumes that, except where there are specific indications to the contrary, the fictional London is like the real one. Fictionally, the city in which the action takes place is large and modern and industrial and whatever else London actually is, unless the story indicates otherwise. But see Chapter 4. With the setting thus in place, the author is free to focus the reader's attention on the characters and their doings. The representing of objects is more than a device of convenience, however. Some representations contain statements or assertions about real things, and that requires reference to them. The referring need not be representing, as we have seen, but it can be, and representing is sometimes the method of choice. The indirectness of allegory is useful in effecting veiled references, and even obvious allegorical references carry a certain air of pretense, transparent though it may be. When simple, straightforward references are desired, as in historical novels, portrait and religious icons, representing may be preferable. Moreover, a statement that includes a representation of a thing can be especially powerful and compelling, for to represent something is to prescribe imaginings about it. And engaging in imaginings about something, George Bush, the French Revolution, oneself, is a good way to deepen one's understanding of it. Indeed, the statement may be unnecessary. Oh, that's interesting. Representations of objects prescribe imaginings about them, even if they are not to be understood also as vehicles of statement or assertion. This, incidentally, brings out one failing of the fashionable practice of regarding representations in a quasi-linguistic light. Linguistic utterances are informative, typically, because they are vehicles of assertion. It is because in uttering certain words, a speaker is asserting or stating that a building is on fire or that a train is about to depart, that one learns from his words that this is so. But a representation, by inducing appropriate imaginings, provides its illumination quite apart from any such communicative role. Sorry, 2 seconds. Hmm. We inherit from Aristotle or his commentators the notion that the job of poetry is to reveal general truths, not truth about particular things. Sorry. Even so, representing particulars can be helpful. One way to demonstrate One way to demonstrate the evils of war in general is to cite, for example, to represent a specific instance such as the Spanish Civil War. The work can thus engage and utilize what appreciators know independently about that particular case and the insight achieved by their imaginings about it to guide them toward general conclusions. Again, this may be accomplished even if the work is not construed as a comment on the particular case or as a statement of the general truth. I will copy that. Truths, not truth. Truths, plural, plural. Not all objects of representations interest us particularly. Sorry. Even as instances of general truths, and the work does not always direct our interest toward them. They can be rather remote from the point of the work. This is sometimes true of settings, backgrounds, and locations. The purpose of locating the action of King Kong in New York, thus making New York an object of the work, is not to deepen our understanding of New York or especially to direct our attention to that city. What is the purpose, then? We noticed that our imaginings are sometimes about things that are not themselves focuses of interest, such things as slumps, a pile of snow, a plastic doll. I am convinced that these objects contribute significantly to the imaginative experience. If they do not, it is hard to understand why imaginings so often have such incidental things as objects. I have suggested rather vaguely that they provide substance to one's imaginings, thereby enhancing their vivacity. Works whose objects are not central to our interests, at least while we are appreciating the work, ones that prescribe imaginings about such objects utilize the contribution they make to the imaginings. The fact that it is in New York, an actual city and a familiar one, that King Kong escapes and has his various adventures, the fact that he looks down from the skyscraper on the well-known landmarks of Manhattan gives the movie a distinctive flavor strikingly different from that of fantasies like Gulliver's Travels and The Hobbit, which unfold in purely fictional lands or on purely imaginary planets, or even the Faulkner stories set in the fictitious but typical Yok-Napataupa County. Some may propose that the familiar real-world setting lends an air of believability to the unbelievable. I think it is more a matter of engaging our personal interest in the unbelievable events, of our being able to say such things as "I once stood at the very corner where fictionally Kong captured the little girl." I am reminded of the difference it makes in reading about historical events to have visited the places where they transpired: the Tower of London, the Parthenon, Gettysburg, Rome, Jerusalem. Reflexive representation. Some representations are their own objects. We saw in Chapter 1 that props in children's games can be objects of the imaginings they prescribe. A doll directs players of the game not just to imagine a baby, but to imagine the doll itself to be a baby. So it generates fictional truths about itself. It represents itself. Let's call it a reflexive representation. The reader of Gulliver's Travels is to imagine that a certain ship's physician named Gulliver traveled to various exotic lands and kept a journal detailing his adventures, but he is to imagine also, about the very book he is reading, that it is such a journal. The full title of Swift's novel is Travels into Several Remote Nations of the World by Lemuel Gulliver. The novel thus makes it fictional of itself, that it is an account of a traveller's adventures in places like Lilliput, Brobdingnag, and Huinmeland. It too is reflexive. Literary fictions in the form of letters, diaries, and journals are in general reflexive. Tristram Shandy makes it fictional of itself that it is an autobiography. Fictionally, A Perfect Vacuum by Stanislaw Lem is a collection of book reviews, including a review of A Perfect Vacuum. Fictionally, Beckett's Malone Dice is a rambling account of a man's last days, scribbled in a notebook on his deathbed. Reflexivity is a recurring theme in the drawings of Saul Steinberg. The lines constituting figure 3.2 are such that fictionally they have just been inscribed by a rather intense artist seated at a table, and this includes the lines whereby the artist, his table, and his pen are portrayed. Roy Lichtenstein's Little Big Painting, figure 3.3, is a larger than life-size painting of brushstrokes, which represents part of itself is brushstrokes. It is fictional of the paint of the canvas that it was put there by four not very careful swipes with a paintbrush. The Steinberg and Lichtenstein pieces are special. Most paintings and drawings are not reflexive, except in the way that even non-figurative pictures are. It is fictional in Titian's Venus that a woman is reclining on a couch, but it is not fictional of the painting or any part of it that it is a woman or a couch. Venus does not in that way represent itself. Sorry. C'est ça, je pense, quelle est la date indiquée. Some cases are unclear. One might be inclined to interpret the 4th century marble head of Constantine the Great in Rome as being such that, fictionally, it, the sculpted block of marble itself, is the head of Constantine. But I find this construal much less compelling than understanding a doll to make it fictional of itself that it is a baby. The difference is probably due to the fact that more of the doll's actual properties are such that fictionally the baby has them. If the doll is in Decatur, Georgia, fictionally the baby is there. If Chris cuddles the doll, then fictionally Chris cuddles the baby. But it is not at all obvious that fictionally Constantine or his head is wherever the marble sculpture is, that fictionally he rides on a truck if the sculpture does, and so on. The sculpture is 8 feet high, but surely it is not fictional that Constantine's head is that large. It is not the sculpture's function, at least, to be involved in a game in which fictionally a curator cuddles Constantine if he should somehow manage to cuddle the block of marble. So the doll corresponds to itself in many respects in which the sculpture does not. It comes closer to matching itself, that is, informally, the fictional baby is more like the doll than the fictional Constantine is like the sculpture. We should not be surprised that because of the doll is more naturally regarded as representing itself, since, as we saw, a necessary condition for works representing a given object is that it correspond, to a certain degree, to the object. But we need not stew over these uncertainties. There are various means by which representations speak out themselves as objects. The usual techniques for referring to other things are available. A perfect vacuum and the film Blazing Saddles refer to themselves by name. If a picture depicts a room with a picture on the wall, whether the depicted picture is the depicting one itself is to be decided in the same way one would decide whether another picture is its object. Did the artist intend it to represent itself? Does it come reasonably close to matching itself? Can spectators be expected to recognize that it prescribes imaginings about itself? Did attention to the picture when unfinished guide the artist's hand in finishing painting it? It is perfectly possible in these cases for one not to realize that the represented work is identical with the representing one. If a moviegoer has forgotten the name of the movie he's watching, he may miss the fact that it is the one that, fictionally, the characters go to see when they walk under the marquee advertising Blazing Saddles. We shall be more interested in cases in which the fact that a given thing is identical with the representation or part of it is crucial to establishing that that thing is represented. If per impossibly perhaps figure 3.2 had been composed of lines different from the ones that actually compose it, it would represent those other lines rather than the ones it does represent, even if it looked no different from how it actually does. Being part of the work is part of what makes its lines its objects. One can scarcely notice that it represents lines without realizing that the lines it represents are those of the drawing itself. Let's say that figure 3.2 refers to itself as itself. Gulliver's Travels does also. What makes its words among the objects it represents is in part their presence in the work, and the reader will not notice that words are represented without realizing that those of the text itself are. Blazing saddles and the picture depicting itself hanging on a wall, by contrast, do not refer to themselves as themselves. Reflexive representations, or both of these sorts, may but need not represent themselves as representations. Little Big Painting does not. It presents itself as merely an inert brush stroke. But Steinberg's drawing does. Fictionally, the lines of the drawing constitute a depiction of an artist seated at a table. This gives us one fictional world nested within another. It is fictional that the lines make it fictional that an artist is seated at a table. In fact, we have infinitely many embedded fictional worlds, which each of them containing the actual lines of the drawing. Fictionally, a man has just drawn those lines, thereby making it fictional that a man has just drawn them, making it fictional that, and so on ad infinitum. It is fictional in Blazing Saddles that some of the characters watch a movie, Blazing Saddles, which makes it fictional, by implication anyway, that its characters watch a movie, Blazing Saddles, which John Barth's framed tale consists of the words "Once upon a time there" on one side of a page, and "Was a story that began" on the other, with instructions to twist the paper and fasten the ends together, forming a Mobius strip, in Lost in the Fun House. So the story reads: Once upon a time there was a story that began, once upon a time there was a story that began, once upon a time ad infinitum. These words, the word types anyway, represent themselves as representations representing themselves as representations representing. Of course, representations need not be reflexive in order to establish fictional worlds within fictional worlds. All representations do, whether or not they represent themselves as representations or as anything else. There are pictures of pictures, Matisse's Red Studio, stories about stories, Keith Ford, The Gold Shoveler, plays about plays, Hamlet, sculptures of sculptures. There is a 30 BC sculpture of a Roman patrician with busts of his ancestors, circa 30 BC. Films about films, Truffaut's Day for Night. Novels about novels, Italo Calvino's If on a Winter's Night a Traveller. Novels about pictures, Oscar Wilde's Picture of Dorian Gray. Poems about pictures, Keats' Ode on a Grecian Urn. Novels about films, Manuel Puig's Kiss of the Spider Woman, and so on. All representations make it fictional that there is a work that makes various other propositions fictional. It is possible to construe some of them as making it fictional of themselves or parts of themselves that they are such works, but others need not or cannot be so construed. It is not the picture of Dorian Gray fictional that any part of that novel is a painting of Dorian Gray. Many reflexive representations represent themselves not as works of fiction, but as works of non-fiction. Some represent themselves as biographies, histories, journals, essays. Tristram Shandy, A Perfect Vacuum, Gulliver's Travels. Since biographies and the like do not have fictional worlds, such works do not give us nested fictional worlds. Julio Cortázar's story Blow Up is studiously ambiguous between representing itself as fiction or as non-fiction. Beckett's Malone Dies is fictionally non-fiction for the most part, but with interpolations of what seem to be story fragments, works of fiction. Fictionally, Malone scribbles non-fictionally about his deathbed experiences, but apparently tries his hand on several occasions at storytelling. But there are hints that his story fragments are autobiographical and possibly non-fictional, so it is arguable that Malone Dies represents itself as entirely a work of non-fiction. There is a lot of fun to be had with the devices of representation and reflexive representation. But reflexivity, especially, is also of considerable theoretical importance and will play a significant part in the development of my theory. The inessentiality of objects. To be representational is not necessarily to represent something. Not all representations have objects. Assuming that there are no non-actual entities, that only actual things can be objects of representation. But the notion of having an object, the possibility of representing something, might still be essential to the concept of the representational. It might be that representationality is to be understood in terms of objects, even though particular representations, unicorn pictures, ghost stories, sometimes have none. Mm. I do not think it is. My account in chapter 1 of what it is for something to be representational made no mention of objects. I shall now defend this omission, arguing against those who would introduce the representing of objects earlier and give them a more central theoretical role. I am in opposition here to one analogy commonly drawn between representation and language. We have seen that the relation of representing, the relation between representations and their objects, when they have objects, is much like linguistic reference. Like the relation names and other referring expressions bear to their reference. Linguistic referring expressions would be promising candidates for models by which to understand representation if representing is central to representation. Our basic building block, one might suppose, should be a pervasive semantic relation which we might call reference or denotation, and which is best understood by looking at its paradigm instances referenced by linguistic referring expressions. Representing will be construed as an instance of this semantic relation, and the representational will be explained in terms of it. This program follows the spirit of Nelson Goodman's slogan, "Denotation is the core of representation." Goodman uses representation both more broadly and more narrowly than I do. It applies for him to non-fiction as well as to fiction, and he applies it only to pictures and other fictional or non-fictional depictions, excluding works of literature. It is abundantly evident, however, that he considers denotation to be the core of all that I call representation. Unfortunately, a fundamental unclarity in what Goodman means by denotation makes it impossible to be sure what his position is. When he speaks of representations denoting things, he may have in mind something like what I call representing the relation representations bear to their objects, but he may mean instead something akin to matching. Here is the evidence in favor of the first interpretation. Goodman speaks of pictures depicting or representing the things they denote, or being pictures of them. To match something is not thereby to be a picture of it or to depict or represent it, in any ordinary sense of these expressions. His examples of denoting pictures, constable paintings of Marlborough Castle, portraits of Churchill and the Duke of Wellington, are clear cases of representing which are highly unlikely to be instances of matching. All ordinarily so-called portraits of Churchill have Churchill as an object, but most glorify or deprecate their object in one way or another, and it is a safe bet that in every case the Churchill in the picture differs in some details from the real one, that is to say, that the portrait fails to match Churchill. Goodman recognizes the possibility of misrepresenting what is denoted, but misrepresentation is representing without matching. The evidence for the second reading is this. Goodman claims that what a picture depicts, that is to say, what it denotes, depends only on its pictorial properties, that is to say, roughly, what colors the picture has at what places. We have seen that this is not true of what picture represents. Titles, intentions, causal relations, or some combination of these come into play. Perhaps what a picture matches depends only on its pictorial properties, given the pictorial system and the nature of the objects to be matched. He simulates the relation between a picture and what it represents, that is to say, denotes, to the relation between a predicate and what it applies to. A picture's matching something does seem comparable to a predicate applying to it, whereas representing is more like the relation between a name and its bearer. I see no escape from the conclusion that Goodman's notion of denotation hides a serious conflation of representing and matching. Okay. The question is crucial since there is a fundamental divergence between representing and matching. Let's adopt the first reading for now. Let us take denotation to be a relation representations bear to their objects, in which referring expressions also bear to their reference. War and Peace and portraits of Napoleon will be said to denote Napoleon, and so will the name Napoleon Bonaparte and the phrase that the Emperor of France crowned in 1804. Is denotation, so understood, the core of representation? Goodman agrees that not all representations denote, that representation is not simply a matter of actually denoting something. He has no sympathy for non-actual entities, but he offers hints about how denotation may underlie the representational in a less direct manner. Although representation thus depends upon a relationship among symbols rather than upon their relationship to denotata, it nevertheless depends upon their use as denotative symbols. A dense set of elements does not constitute a representational scheme unless at least ostensibly provided with denotata. The rule correlating symbols with denotata may result in no assignment of any actual denotata to any symbol, so that the field of reference is null. But elements become representations only in conjunction with some such correlation actual or in principle. Novitz in Pictures and Their Use objects to Goodman's understanding of pictorial representation as fundamentally denotative, but for reasons rather contrary to mine. Okay. This is not very explicit. But taking the denoting in question to be representing, I do not think that it comes even close to the truth. The representational, either in my sense or in Goodman's, is not in any way to be understood in terms of denoting. Representations are not such even partly by virtue of their having a denoting role, either actual or implied or purported or pretended or ostensible or in principle. To be representational is not thereby to belong to a denoting scheme. The contrast with linguistic referring expressions is telling. Referring expressions are to be understood in terms of their denoting role. This goes for ones that do not actually denote anything as well as for ones that do. All of them are, let us say, denotative. There are several kinds of non-denoting referring expressions. The only person to climb Mount Everest, Grendel, and Paul Henry O'Malley will serve as illustrations. Used in what Keith Donnellan calls the attributive manner, reference and definite descriptions. Sorry. When your heart's not open, when your heart's not open, when j'ai enfin une appli utile sur mon tel. Dès que j'ai 5 minutes, je vais voir Nicard. J'ai dit. first person to climb Mount Everest denotes someone, but the only person to climb Mount Everest does not. Ah oui. The difference is simply that the world happens to contain someone who was the first to climb Everest, but not someone who was the only person to do so. The rule correlating symbols with denotata does not, I suppose, assign any denotatum to the latter expression. It is not clear that there is a rule which applies to Grendel and Paul Henry O'Malley. I assume that Paul Henry O'Malley has never been used as a name, not even in fiction. It is not because denotata purportedly picked out for them happen not to exist that they fail to denote. Grendel, however, is at least in one sense ostensibly provided with the denotatum. We pretend, imagine, make believe that Grendel, as it occurs in Beowulf, names an actual person. No one has even pretended that Paul Henry O'Malley denotes. Yet it is denotative in the sense that it is a member of a class of things names that are conventionally assigned denoting roles. It belongs to a repertoire of potential denoters. There are isolated examples of non-denoting representations that are denotative in similar ways. Suppose that what appear to be dinosaur footprints are discovered in Arizona, and that an artist is commissioned to draw the dinosaur responsible for them. His sketch is so labeled and is displayed in a museum with the footprints. But suppose the prints were not actually made by a dinosaur at all, but were carved in rock by an ambitious but frustrated paleontologist. The sketch is like the only person to climb Mount Everest. Gulliver's Travels and illustrations of Gulliver are non-denoting but denotative in the way the name Grendel is. Perhaps Paul Klee's color corresponds to Paul Henry O'Malley. It belongs to a class of things, person pictures, that often are used to denote. It should be obvious that representations do not have to be denotative in any of these ways. There could well be a society, much like that in paragraph, in which artists produce pictures of animals and people, animal pictures and person pictures, but never once portraying actual animals or actual people. None of their pictures have actual objects, and there is no provision for making anything an object of a representation. There is no convention whereby attaching a title or other sign to a representation makes it represent some actual thing. Artists never use anything as a model in producing a representation, let us say. They do not know what representing an object is, and so cannot intend a work to represent anything. Drawing a bison is thought of always as creating, producing an imaginary bison, never as symbolizing or referring to an animal already in existence. It is no accident that children speak of making a giraffe when they draw one. Hmm, that's interesting. A bison depiction in such a context is not in any way denotative. It does not purport to denote anything in the way that the dinosaur picture in the museum does, nor is there any sort of pretense that it denotes. Neither is it one of the kind of things which are normally or typically used to denote, yet certainly it is representational. The notion of the representational is thus independent of that of denoting. Denotation is not the core of representation. The failure to recognize this important point is due largely, I believe, to confusion between representing and matching. Once these are properly disentangled, there is no excuse for supposing the representational to presuppose or depend on the possibility of representing, the possibility of denoting. I have not claimed that literary representation is possible without provision for representing. Perhaps literary works necessarily consist of linguistic expressions, some of which are denotative, and perhaps this means that the works themselves are denotative. But if literary representations are fundamentally denotative, it is because they are literary, not because they are representations. Representation is not to be explained in terms of denotation. The notion of objects of representation is inessential to that of the representational. In the preceding pages, I have assumed that only actual things can be objects of representations, that works represent, denote, only real-world entities. We shall look seriously at this assumption in the following section and in part 4. But let us consider now what effect dropping it would have on the present question.
J'avais un doute parce que c'était pas le même visuel.
The idea that denotation is the core of representation may seem to fare better than it has so far if we are willing to countenance non-actual objects. One might even hope for a simpler account of the representational in terms of denoting than any we have been considering. If representations can have fictitious objects, if, for instance, the bison picture described represents a fictional bison, it may look as though every representation will actually denote something. Actually, non-denoting representations would still be possible, though there were ghosts about. The end seems to be one. There were ghosts about. The end seems to be one. We will not have to worry about potential or purported denotation or denotation in principle or there being provision for denoting, even if nothing is actually denoted. This alternative will not tempt Goodman, whose hostility toward fictional entities is notorious, but it may attract some who have managed so far to assuage their ontological qualms. Mais dans les deux cas, il n'y a rien à prendre, hein, tu peux venir comme ça, alors peut-être qu'il vaut mieux réserver pour Henri IV, mais je sais pas où. Even if we do recognize fictitious entities, however, it does not follow that the notion of having objects, fictional if not actual ones, should be taken as basic in explaining representation. The best procedure, in my opinion, would still be to explain representation in terms of games of make-believe and the generation of fictional truths. As I have done, and only then to introduce the idea of objects of representation, relying again on what has been said about games of make-believe and fictional truths. In particular, it will not be reasonable to start with a general semantic relation, denotation, simulating the relation between representations and their possibly fictional objects to linguistic reference, and use it to define the representational. Those who are set on using a linguistic model for representation will not find encouragement in the recognition of fictitious objects. Let us suppose, for the sake of argument, that Moby Dick and Scholar have fictional objects. Moby Dick represents a hub and also Dagu, the whale, and so on. Scholar represents a certain fictional scholar, the man in the picture. We must now reconsider the supposed analogy between representing and linguistic reference. The relation Moby Dick and Scholar bear to their fictional objects differs significantly from the relation between referring expressions and their reference. There is ample justification for classifying the representing of actual objects with linguistic reference as instances of denoting, but we should balk at including the representing of fictional objects in cases like this. We might allow that a representation denotes immigrant fictional objects, ones whose homes are in other representations, since immigrants are independent of the representations to which they immigrate. The most striking difference is this: a hab and the scholar are not independent of the work that represent them. A hab owes his existence, such as it is, and also his nature, to Moby Dick. If the novel had been written differently in certain respects, or not at all, he would not have existed. There would have been no such character, or he would not have been as he is. Falstaff holds that characters are eternally existing kinds, and so are not created but merely picked out by representations in works and worlds. But this identification is objectionable on independent grounds. See Walton, Review of Falstaff. Actual objects of representation, by contrast, exist and are as they are quite independently of the works that represent them, and reference of referring expressions are similarly independent of the referring expressions, except when representations or referring expressions denote themselves. This ought at least to give pause to those who would have us understand the relation between representations and fictitious, as well as actual objects, on the model of linguistic reference. Sorry, 2 seconds.
Ok, ça marche. Je vais quand même essayer de t'appeler demain, voir s'il y a moyen de réserver.
Shall we say that Moby Dick creates a hab and, in addition, denotes him and construe at least the denoting of the model of linguistic referring? That would at best lessen the utility of the linguistic model, for the representation's creative function would have to be understood separately. Moreover, it is not clear that once we say Moby Dick creates a hab, there is any point in going on to say that it denotes him. The addition seems gratuitous. Yet without it, there is nothing for the linguistic model to explain. There do not seem to be two distinct functions, creating and denoting, which require independent analysis. What would it be like for a work to create its characters without denoting them? If what is to be explained is a single relation, this relation seems insufficiently analogous to linguistic reference to warrant the use of the linguistic model. It is worth noting that the make-believe theory holds promise for accommodating the creative function of representations, whether or not we recognize fictitious entities. Part of the story is that representations create by making existential propositions not true but fictional. The rest has yet to be told. Should representation be understood on the model of linguistic predicates rather than referring expressions? This suggestion goes well with the idea that denotation is the core of representation if the denotation in question is matching rather than representing. Goodman, we saw, can be read with more or less equal justice as construing denotation either way. In fact, he explicitly assimilates the relation between a picture and what it represents, the relation between a predicate and what it applies to. Languages of art. The grounds of this assimilation are obscure, especially since so much of what Goodman says suggests that the denoting he takes to be the core of representation is representing rather than matching, and so points toward referring expressions rather than predicates as analogues of representations. Bennett, Depiction and Convention, has advanced a more explicit theory. based loosely on demystified versions of some of Goodman's remarks, according to which pictures are themselves non-linguistic predicates. Goodman's nominalism bars him from expressing the analogy this way. Bennett takes as fundamental the role that pictures play in communication. Pictures are used to make sentences and to enable people to communicate with each other in depiction and convention. His claim is not that this is the most important use of pictures, but rather that it is one without which there would be no pictorial representation at all. Objects of representation do not stand to gain a central place in our theory on this proposal, since what a work represents, what it has as objects, is independent of what it matches. But let us pause briefly to consider it anyway. There is this much analogy at least between predicates and representations. Both indicate, pick out, specify properties. The predicate is a man indicates the property of being a man. Scholar indicates the property of being a man with a certain look. The telltale heart indicates the property of being a man who kills someone and buries the body beneath his floorboards, and so on. Predicates apply to and representations match whatever there is, if anything, that possesses the properties they pick out. It is tempting to push the analogy further. Predicates are devices not only for picking out properties, but also for attributing them to particular things. This threatens to bring back objects of representation in a central role. But here the analogy breaks down. It is not the function of the bison picture to attribute the property of being a bison to anything. People use predicates to attribute properties to things, to say of things that they possess certain properties. I established that such communicative uses are inessential to the representational, that there need be no provision for so using representations. But a representation might be said to attribute a property to something even if it is not used in communication. A picture labeled Joan's Garden might introduce or specify the singular proposition that Joan's garden has certain properties, without being used to inform anyone about Joan's garden or to perform any other illocutionary actions. Yet it is clear that pictures do not necessarily have chat pictures the function of specifying singular propositions. There is no provision for using the bison picture, with or without a caption or title, to introduce a proposition about a particular bison. The job of specifying such propositions is not an essential function of pictorial representation, and hence not of representation in general. This is not to deny that specifying propositions is central to representation. Representations make propositions fictional, and they specify the propositions they make fictional. But the propositions need not be singular ones about particular things. The bison picture specifies and makes fictional the existential proposition that there is a bison, although its being a picture of a bison does not consist merely in its doing this, as we shall see. It does not in any sense attribute the property it picks out to a particular thing. Not at least to any actual thing. Shall we say that it attributes that property to a fictitious beast, the bison in the picture, presuming that there is such a thing? Not in a sense very close to that in which predicates attribute properties to things. What properties a thing possesses is independent of what predicates are attributed to it. But the picture makes the picture bison a bison. Le cœur dans les étoiles. Ma grand-mère. We still have the fact that representations, like predicates, pick out properties, even if they do not serve to attribute properties to things. But to say this is to say very little. Lots of things are easily regarded as picking up properties. Works of non-fiction do. The rondo movement of a Mozart symphony may be said to indicate youthful exuberance, the Parthian stability and order. Expressive works in general can be thought of as picking out the properties they express. Goodman holds that a necessary condition for expression is reference to what is expressed. Throwing a hole through a hoop in a basketball game could be said to specify the property of scoring a goal by way of bringing it about that this property is instantiated. It is not very illuminating to know that representations belong to the enormous and diverse category of specifiers and properties. Nor is it obvious that linguistic predicates deserve to be regarded as especially central or paradigm instances of this class, ones to be taken as models for understanding others, such as representations. What is interesting and important is what is done with the properties that are specified. The central function of representations is to make propositions involving the properties they specify fictional. One might find an affinity between representations and throwing a ball through a hoop. This action makes it true in the real world, that a goal is scored. Scholar makes it fictional, true in a fictional world, that there is a man of a certain sort. There seems to be no closer affinity between representations and linguistic predicates. The central function of the latter is presumably something like that of being used to inform people of the truth of propositions involving indicated properties. That is a far cry from making propositions fictional. Non-actual objects. Shakespeare's Julius Caesar is about a Roman emperor named Julius Caesar. Cervantes' Don Quixote is about an errant knight who goes by the name of Don Quixote. One work generates fictional truths about Caesar, the other fictional truths about Quixote. Readers of the novel are to engage in imaginings about Don Quixote, as spectators of the play are to engage in imaginings about Caesar. Don Quixote, it seems, is an object of Don Quixote, just as Julius Caesar is an object of Julius Caesar, the novel. Picasso's Seated Woman is a picture of a certain unnamed woman, as his marvelous portrait of Stravinsky is a picture of Stravinsky. Fictionally, the woman is seated with her hands clasped loosely together, and fictionally, Stravinsky is doing the same. This woman is an object of the one picture as Stravinsky is of the other. So it seems. But mustn't something exist in order to be an object of representation, in order for there to be fictional truths about it? Julius Caesar and Igor Stravinsky are real people, but Don Quixote and Picasso's Seated Woman are not. Some would minimize this difference by claiming that there are such entities as Don Quixote and the Seated Woman, even though they do not exist, or that they have a special kind of existence, or exist in a special realm distinct from the real world. Don Quixote and the Seated Woman are thus rescued from oblivion to serve as objects of Cervantes and Picasso's representations. Such metaphysical contortions are easily ridiculed, but they deserve sympathy and understanding. We need to appreciate and to accommodate somehow in our theory the enormous intuitive urge to deny the undeniable, to make room somewhere in the universe for Don Quixote and his fellow fictions. Recognizing them may do little for the idea that representationality is to be understood in terms of a quasi-linguistic relation of denotation, as I argued earlier, but that is by no means the main ground of their claim for recognition. The best way to muster sympathy for fictitious objects is to try to do without them. If there is no Don Quixote, there are no fictional truths about him. So perhaps Cervantes' novel makes it fictional merely that there is a person whose name is Don Quixote, who has a squire named Sancho Panza, who mistakes windmills for giants and flocks of sheep for armies, and so on. See Plantinga, Nature of Necessity. It is fictional that all this is true of someone or other. The novel does not specify whom fictionally it is true of, for the simple reason that there is no one to specify. If there is no actual or non-actual person of whom Seated Woman makes it fictional that she is clasping her hands loosely together, the painting would seem to make it fictional merely that there is someone or other who is doing so. If this is right, ordinary claims like Don Quixote mistook windmills for giants, and the woman's hands are clasped loosely together, which sounds so similar to ones like Julius was warned of the Ides of March by a seer, and Stravinsky's hands are clasped loosely together, will have to be understood very differently. We can take statements 3 and 4 almost at face value, apparently, with only the addition of the implicits in Shakespeare's play or in Picasso's portrait, or something to that effect. but 1 and 2 demand drastic reformulation. A first tab would be to gloss 1 as 5. It is Don Quixote fictional that there is someone named Don Quixote who mistook windmills for giants. This transforms what looks like a statement about a particular thing into one that says merely what sort of thing it is fictional that there is. This analysis is not very remotely adequate. Suppose that the central character of Cervantes' novel did not mistake windmills for giants, but that in an obscure passage one of the characters mentions a remote ancestor of Don Quixote who shares his name and who did mistake windmills for giants. Then, fictionally, there is a person named Don Quixote who mistook windmills for giants, even though one, which is about the Don Quixote, is false. We must be able somehow to distinguish different characters of that name, it seems, and that cannot be done without recognizing characters. A healthy suspicion of the prospects of getting along without fictitious objects is very much in order. A second failing of this analysis is that 5 is in part about the name Don Quixote, whereas 1 uses but does not mention it. The suspicion deepens when we consider cases in which it is not known whether a given work has an actual object or not. We may have no idea whether or not an aboriginal cave painting or a contemporary sketch portrays a real person. But this uncertainty may scarcely matter. Our experience need not depend in any fundamental way on which we suppose to be the case. To describe the uncertainty as uncertainty about which of two drastically different forms of fictional truths generated by the work take would be to make much too much of it. It would seem more faithful to the phenomenology of the experience to allow that we know that the work has an object, that it generates fictional truths about something, and that we engage in the appropriate imaginings about it. What we do not know is just whether the object is actual or merely fictional. When we describe something as a picture of a person, we need not feel that this claim is radically ambiguous, that it may mean either that there is a person whom the work pictures or something entirely different. Some representations obviously do generate fictional truths, just about what sorts of things they are, not about particular actual or fictional things. These contrast sharply with Don Quixote and Seated Woman, as well as with Julius Caesar and the portrait of Stravinsky. But the contrast is in danger of being lost if we refuse to allow that Don Quixote and Seated Woman have fictional objects. Robert Howell has emphasized this difference. See also Fine Problem of Non-Existence and in fictional objects. The difference is best understood in light of a corresponding contrast between two sorts of imaginings. I can imagine a squirrel in a tree, or I can imagine merely that there is a squirrel in the tree, that the tree has a squirrel, some squirrel or other, in it. I need not have any particular actual squirrel in mind in the first case, which I am imagining to be in the tree. Yet it seems appropriate to describe what I am doing as imagining a particular squirrel. My imagining is likely to be accompanied by a visual image of a squirrel, although this too is unnecessary. In the second case, when I merely imagine the tree to be squirrel infested, I do not imagine a particular squirrel in the same sense, and although my imagining may be accompanied by an image of a tree, together with the understanding that the tree is squirreled, it cannot, it seems, be accompanied by an image of a squirrel. To add a squirrel image to the tree image would be to imagine a particular squirrel. The nature of this difference is elusive. All squirrels are particular ones, and no doubt this holds for my imaginary worlds as well as for the real world. So to imagine that some squirrel or other resides in the tree is, surely, to imagine that there is a particular squirrel there, some particular squirrel or other. But to imagine this is not to imagine of a particular squirrel, one that I can pick out, identify, refer to, that it is in the tree. That, it is tempting to say, is what I do in the first case, and now we are in hot water again. If, when I imagine a squirrel, I can identify the squirrel that I am imagining, there must really be such a squirrel to be identified, even if it is not an actual one. A representation may prescribe imaginings of either kind. This very short story, George was an old and almost worn-out ghost who lived in the run-down mansion on Spruce Street, the end, prescribes imaginings about a particular ghost. A story that goes, there, there were ghosts about. The old run-down mansion on Spruce Street was home for some of them, the end. Does not. It asks us to imagine a haunted house, one that is ghost infested, to imagine merely that there is some ghost, or rather, perhaps more than one, haunting the house. Story A is a story about a ghost, but I hesitate to describe B this way, for it seems there is no particular fictional ghost which it is about. The ghost in A has a name, whereas none of the ghosts in B do. At least the reader is not told their names. But this is not the crucial difference. We might expand B thus. There were ghosts about. The old rundown mansion on Spruce Street was home for some of them, including one named George. No doubt, since at that time all ghosts were called George. George. The end. We are again asked to imagine only that there is a ghost satisfying a certain description, one who is old and almost worn out and lives in the mansion on Spruce Street and who bears the name George. Moreover, if A were changed to he was an old and almost worn out ghost living in the run-down mansion on Spruce Street, the end, it would still prescribe imaginings about a particular ghost. It is not fictional in A that there is only one ghost named George living in the mansion. For all we know, there might be lots of them. Nothing in the story indicates otherwise. We could expand A to make it explicit that George is not unique. George was an old and almost worn out ghost who lived in the rundown mansion on Spruce Street. He shared his abode with two other ghosts, both of them also named George, who were also old and almost worn out. The end. But there still seems to be a particular non-actual ghost which the story is about, one that is referred to by the first occurrence of George in the story and by the pronoun he. What happens if we alter B to make it fictional that there is a unique ghost fitting a certain description? There were ghosts about. The old run-down mansion on Spruce Street was home for some of them. A light was on in the attic. A ghost must have gone up there, only one, since ghosts like to be alone in attics. The end. Shall we say that B is about a particular ghost, the one in the attic, that it prescribes imaginings about a particular non-actual ghost? I am inclined not to. The story still makes it fictional, only that some ghost or other has a certain collection of properties, now including the property of being the only one in the attic. Intuitively, we seem still not know which ghost is the one in the attic, although that again implies that if we did know this, there would be a non-actual ghost which we know about. I expect that in some contexts the contrary construal of B would be reasonable. In any case, making it fictional that there is a unique F is not necessary for representing a particular F, even if it is sufficient. The contrast between A and B has pictorial analogues. Compare picture X showing a fish or several of them swimming in a lake, and the picture Y of a fish lake, one which obviously, let us assume, contains fish, although no fish are actually shown. Both pictures make it fictional that there are fish in a lake. Fishes. But X, it seems, represents one or several particular fish, and Y does not. It is less easy to say whether a picture showing a fisherman in the process of landing a catch, but not the fish, represents a particular fish, although it clearly does not depict one.